we're going to talk about today is Think Global and Act Local in OT security. What I like to do is walk through a little bit of, let me get the right session here. I'd like to walk through a little bit of an introduction to both myself and the topic. What I'm hoping to do today is bring some practical lessons learned that came from many years in this space doing OT security. And I know that we've had 2 full days of great security content. So when I talk about introductions, I'm going to assume a certain level of understanding. Wanted to make sure that we sort of had a base level, but I want to show some ideas, some newer concepts that we're seeing many organizations adopt. And so I'm going to walk through some case studies, but also some framing, primarily of how to be more effective in OT endpoint management. In light of what we have for risks, and we're going to assume that we have the risk, but in light of what we have for real world constraints in OT. I work for a company called Verve Industrial Protection. Verve is an industrial systems integrator. So our founder is an electrical engineer, former GE Westinghouse, and we grew from that into reusable tool sets, one of which is a security platform. And so one of the things that most people don't know about us is that we've spent about 26 years now, 25 needs to be updated, about 26 years in the OT space. And for 13 of them, we've been doing security solutions, including the deployment of an agent-based approach to security management, very safely on all OEMs. And so that's part of the stuff I want to stretch people's minds with is, we have a lot of IT assets in this space. And so the more we can adapt IT types of tool sets, but with a very OT unique spin, the better off we'll be, hence the concept of thinking global, but acting local. And I'll lay that a little bit better. Verve itself is a vendor-neutral organization. We have a number of OT system integrator type of projects like PLC upgrades and DCS programming, et cetera. We also have a lot of historian capabilities, and we also have, of course, the security. So we actually partner with our clients over long-term, as most systems integrators do. We're not really, commodity or widget sort of sales thing. And so some of what I'm sharing today is actual, not some, actually all of it, is real-world organizations and their experiences in the space. Myself, by the way, I've been around for a while. You may have seen me locally, Untitled Chapter meeting president with Paul Petrowski and Nadjo when we were fortunate enough to have her near us here in Calgary. I've been doing ICS security for about 20 plus years, having worked in Kaun and of course Honeywell as well. So getting started, this was, some of these are we're using from another presentation or different levels of maturity in the audience, but most people, it's very rare that we find somebody with nothing. And so some are very rudimentary, like they have some sort of inventory, maybe some patching or what have you. But at least everybody has some level of program investments and policies, right? Some sort of inventory. And we can't just throw out the script, right? But what we have seen happen, regardless of how far along you are on that maturity, is we've usually seen a patchwork of tools and therefore a patchwork of coverage. And we find that sometimes that's because of what we call the mouse and a cookie scenario. If anyone's who's familiar with this story about the mouse, if you give a mouse a cookie, the idea is that you want to grab the mouse, you offer a mouse a cookie, and he says, oh, well, this is interesting, but could I have a glass of milk to go with this? And now that they've got a cookie and milk, it's like, well, that was good, but maybe I've got some crumbs on my face. Can I look at a mirror? And the idea is it's like pulling on a thread, right? And so many organizations have started down a path in some cases, oh, my biggest issue is the endpoint, let's go get whitelisting. Or my biggest issue is inventory, so let's go grab a passive tool that gives me a low touch, first passive inventory. Those aren't bad, but in reality, taking those piecemeal bits and pieces and trying to put them into a sustainable, scalable program, which really, if we pause and look forward 2 to 3 to 5 years, we're going to be completely, if we're not already, overrun in terms of asset count to head count, and in terms of risk and the requirements to get better uptime and drive more visibility. So what I'm advocating today is if we stopped and looked at what our end objective was, and then use that towards analyze what we're looking at with an eye towards things that probably aren't going to change, like the increase of IP addresses in an operational environment and the decrease of skilled OT security practitioners, and the need to automate and manage some of these in a way differently than we typically have been. And so what we find many organizations emerging in what we call first generation security. As I mentioned, I've been doing NERC for a while. I was on NERC guidance committees when I worked for Matricon back in 2010, way before we got bought by Honeywell, 2005. And so it's been around for a while. And at the time, OT security really was piecemeal. And so it's no surprise that people have a collection of tools that we call first generation security. What we're advocating, though, is that there's some challenges to that. There's a real challenge to maintaining the current security program like that. Tasks such as patch review, configuration management, logging, etc. They just continue to grow as Patch Tuesday becomes more frequent and more difficult. As I mentioned, the number of IP assets that we have continue to grow. This is a rather old anecdote, but one of my friends at a pipeline company not far east from here, when we first started working together, he had a staff of 3 plus himself, so 4 of them, and there was exactly 3 Windows-based IP-enabled assets in his environment. You fast forward a few years, and he's down to 1 additional staff member, so it's just him and 1 other person, and they're up to 150 IP-enabled assets that need to somehow take care of. So we are getting outnumbered. Regulation, corporate standards continue to improve, whether we're trying to do things for best practice or because we have a corporate or regulatory need. And what this means, again, is that many organizations have disparate solutions. We found one client, actually, I spoke to recently. They have 55 different control security packages of software, 55 different security tools. And I think 8 of them were patching tools. I can probably name about 3 or 4 myself, but I don't know about 8. And so the problem is that different vendors also drive this sometimes. I mean, if I have a multi-vendor environment, I'm probably going to have more than 1 version of antivirus, and maybe one or more versions of backup. Segmentation is something that everybody strives for, but maybe isn't necessarily always consistent. And vulnerability, if anyone doing vulnerability scan-based, hats off to you, because usually scan-based vulnerability in OT is sporadic. It's spread out amongst outages or only on redundant systems. It's often scaled down because the intensity can be difficult. And so, getting real value or real-time value to your vulnerability data is always a challenge. And so then what often happens is security and maintenance is often best effort or manual. If the threat is big enough, we redirect our people to go work on day-to-day stuff, from day-to-day stuff onto real-time risk reduction and patch deployment. But otherwise, that stuff often gets left to the wayside because it's so much further down. And the other thing we're seeing is changes in the organization. When you talk about what a multidisciplinary security program looks like, you're going to have people that want to know data to be able to pull into different functions. Now, whether it's a traditional IT sort of siloed environment where you have endpoint people and vulnerability people and patch people and server build people and network people and security people and perimeter people, or whether you're looking at within an organization, you have regulatory data, you have risk data, you have life cycle data. You can always see that there's different views and different needs, but it always goes back to the endpoint. And so the result is, current generation security is patchwork. There's complexity to it, to the environment, to the management and the capability. Lack of centralized visibility. If you have multiple antivirus tools and backup tools, you can probably, dive into different, visibilities and sort of piece together what your overall status is. A lot more insecurity than you might think. And you have a lot more manual effort and redundant tasks, etc. And as an example, I'm sure most people have heard, it was a little bit older now, but Duke Energy, they actually negotiated a settlement. And I know NERC-CIP isn't security, but compliance is at least a framework that starts to give you the building blocks for a security program, like do you have inventory and software, do you know what your users are, etc. Duke had exactly this sort of patchwork scenario of different tools in different locations. Some people had gone and bought particular OEM's tool, and other bought different piecemeal tools, etc. And at the end of the day, they had such systemic lack of consistency and adherence to the standards that they simply negotiated a single fee for the entire organization, and it was a $10 million negotiation. So I can just imagine if they actually enumerated the list of issues, what that would be. Now, that's a very punitive example, and I'm not trying to, I hate talking this topic with FUD, but the reason those fines were levied was because there were real risks and real lack in their security controls and their awareness and understanding what they had. So that really is maybe a worst case scenario, but is very much a real possibility that your best laid plans. I have some friends that are in this local market, and they're very well spoken and very well understood. But when I see an actual network diagram of one of their facilities through one of our other initiatives, it's like very wide open. And so I asked my friend, I needle him a little, tease him a little bit. They said, well, what we tell them to do and what ends up happening can often be different. So it's a challenge. I get it. Not pointing any fingers. So what do we do and how do we get started? Well, the first thing is we need to revisit some key learnings. These are things, like I said, that we have seen time and time again, whether it's a first pass client that had really rudimentary manual efforts that wants to grow to something automated, or whether it's somebody who has this piecemeal bit of information, has realized they're really not driving it forward, or whether it's somebody that's wanting to look at what they have and really reassess what they're doing. The first thing we need to do is what we call start with the end in mind. And I know that seems very, very simple. Everybody with kids, school-age kids probably hears about the 7 habits they teach the kids, start with the end in mind. What are we trying to get? I can't overstate it. Quite frankly, if you look, for example, on the diagram here, these are recommended, groups or categories that you'll typically find in most organizations. And we've just mapped them in the orange bars across the categories of NIST CSF, so you have a good cross-reference against whatever standard you want to talk about. But you also see that over time, you typically sort of add these more advanced things near to the end, but then eventually you're going to need all of them. And so if we're making a decision today on how we're going to collect inventory and hope that it is as suitable today as it will be when we're building playbooks or doing security analysis, we're probably going to be disappointed and have to come back and revisit that. Unless, of course, we look at how we're going to do inventory relative to not only today, but sustainable over time to keep track of adds, moves, and changes, and to help to continue to feed additional, more mature security practices as we go. So one of the things I always want people to think about is, if you're one of these people that has a program and you're kind of partway in it, what's your wish list if you were to get a do-over? Would you want to automate more of this data and pull it together? Would you want to aggregate data from different data silos? Do you think you could drive a single pane of glass? I know a lot of people that invested a lot in Splunk are trying to get that way. Splunk is, of course, interesting. It does have its own benefits. Maybe there's some challenges to actually pivoting that data into other functions, but are along the lines of these sort of aspirational, bigger picture, second generation sort of approach. And then there's always a debate about scope. What should you do or what do you have to do, right? And that's really where a lot of the patching, latency or the debt that we have is in place, because some do bare minimum and some, push forward. Quick example, we had a client that scanned a system and they found 1,200 known or 1,200 missing patches, 1,200 and some. They hired the vendor to come in and patch it, and the vendor patched everything that the vendor supported and handed the system back to the vendor or to the owner operator. And they rescanned and they found there were still over 800 missing risks. Now, that's not a problem for the vendor. That's because the vendor took care of everything that they knew and supported on that system. But that end owner still owns 800 plus risks on those assets. And I know that the vendor didn't quote unquote approve anything beyond what they patched, but is it acceptable to keep that risk in your environment simply because vendor approval didn't work? To be honest, we helped that client patch the other 800 and they got it down to 0, and nothing happened. I just want to push people on, what are we trying to do? We're trying to do the bare minimum. Vendor says this and that's enough and my hands are tied. Or are we actually trying to do what's more important, that is reduce risk for the companies that we work for? So I mentioned a couple different case studies I want to dig into a little bit here, and I'm going to start with one and then I'm going to drop back into this is how a client decided to revamp and reassess how they did it. And then I want to get to the second part, which is more around the maintenance. So if this is the planning and the refresh or the level setting and starting again case study, the second case study in my presentation today will be how that looks in a day-to-day basis and a couple of use cases. So from the planning perspective, we're talking about a client, a multifunction environment. They had, love the cartoon. Yeah, I like that one too. Transmission and distribution, they had generation, they had renewables as well. They had at least 6 different DCS vendors. So they had different OEMs, different levels of support and capability, different levels of complexity. They had multiple segments within each facility. Not every segment was always connected. They had, islanded subnets and protective relays, for example. They had multiple backup and antivirus platforms and different systems at different locations as well. And they had tried, again, that scan-based vulnerability assessment, but they were doing it once a year during annual outages. And so their data aged almost immediately and wasn't necessarily that valuable. And the inventory that they had was built at the beginning of a subsequent project. They built a project and they added some extra service dollars to have people walk it down. And these generation are 1950s and 60s coal-fired, so they're ridiculously complex. with lots of assets. And then what they tried to do was use the walk down and use change management process to keep the inventory up to date. Well, you can all see where I'm going with this. By the time we came in to work with them on this project, that inventory they thought they had was wrong by 592%, to be exact. And so some real challenges. And what they did was they decided to come in and build a multidiscipline roadmap. So they decided at the top that they wanted to first establish a standard. They said, we are going to pick the CSC 20, and we're going to have a maturity level of 2. And so you can see that their objective was to get to an automated maturity level, which was not just do I have an inventory, but do I have an inventory and it's automated? Do I have a regular review of administrative accounts to understand what software is installed, et cetera? And so they first built a multidiscipline roadmap. And as you can see here, I'm not going to go too terribly much into the specifics, but they had different teams, whether it was design teams, installation teams, evidence collection to grab the data and push back into the reporting and the tracking. Then they had a very real timeline with multiple disciplines to allow them to sort of achieve it. Now, what they did was by establishing CSC, thou shalt be CSC 20, and thou shalt have a maturity level of 2, they then had a starting point. And admittedly, they had a lot of discussions with the CISO's office to say, look, we can't practically do this in OT, or it's not technically feasible. And some were pretty easy. You would just throw it out. I mean, for example, antivirus on networking gear, for example. But the other ones where they wanted to look at encryption, for example, they had legacy stuff that maybe didn't support it, or maybe they couldn't delete or remove or adjust certain administrative accounts because of the way they were built with the OEM, but they negotiated those. And they realized that what they did at the first pass maybe wasn't the end game right out of the gate, but the end game, if they couldn't achieve it, they would at least get as close as they could, then apply some compensating controls to get even closer. And so what they did was they had a very good discussion through multiple divisions and departments with the security and the risk officer to then say, okay, here what we collectively agree is going to be our path forward and where we're going to take exceptions and where we're going to, cross things off the list. And they effectively moved from being reactive in that, oh, here's the latest concern or something, and reactive into now being proactive. And what they realized was that the best way for them to maintain it, because it's one thing to build it, it's another to actually keep it alive and living and breathing and up to date. They found that they needed an inventory, but again, that inventory had a very different context when you looked at the whole program. That inventory, for example, needed to add asset context. When we go to plan a backup solution or a patching solution or reducing risk from the latest vulnerability update, we don't start at the top of the alphabet or the lowest number on the IP address. We want to start with the highest risk assets, right? So asset context, not only is what's its impact to operations, but who's the owner, where is it redundant, what vintage is it, what other levers do we have to pull on it? They found that another key component was the ability to take actions. Too much of that first roadmap I was showing you, people look again at the inventory today and say, oh, let's go grab an inventory tool. And so now they have an inventory, but things are still happening while they try to figure out how they fix it. When I see things are happening, a new security update is released, and suddenly they go even further backwards in their patching level, and the risk level goes up. And so when we talk about anything management, like vulnerability management or asset management, it's not enough simply to have read-only data. You have to have read-only data that directs your action, and then that action has to have tools to allow you to execute them. Alerting for changes and deviations, and it's great to know what is happening to the what the asset is, but it's also important to know what's happening to the asset or with the asset. So alerting, and then finally reporting. This is, I think, one of the biggest sort of things that many organizations feel is more of a throw-in. A throw-in that, oh, okay, great, I got a dashboard, I can look at a pie chart. Well, in reality, when we're talking security and OT, and we're really truly trying to make sure that we are identifying where the risk is and we're reducing and targeting the important stuff as opposed to just trying to boil the ocean, reporting is a fundamental aspect of being able to say, here's where we are today, and now here's where we are, in 3 months or 6 months, but also being able to use that reporting to drill in and say, I think we need to do this or not, and to be able to then pull data to verify or to debunk that particular perspective. Reporting goes a long way towards justifying the effort we're making, but also showing your progress. It can also show the opposite. For example, if you had a decent risk profile and then something like Bluekeep came out, being able to bring that in and see what that did to your environment. And again, with the context portion, not just the raw risk of I've got this many boxes and they all need Bluekeep, I have this many boxes that are of high impact to operations, and maybe they failed their last backup, right? And so you're able to provide context and say, these are the ones that are the highest risk, but you can also take that and pivot into your management, which is part of my second case study. So I'm not going to tell you all that story just yet. But they realized that you had a stack, and it always came back to the inventory. And so what that looks like, when you build that and automate it, is they're able to have this visibility across their inventory, and they pull inventory in from multiple asset classes, OS-based, networking, as well as your embedded, right? And that inventory in the context is what you then are able to mine from that single user interface into vulnerability data versus configuration or patch or user or network. And again, this sort of putting all of your data into a single perspective allows you then to provide context at the viewability, the reporting capability. So your information comes up, and then as you take actions and go move on the devices, they then refresh and update the visibility. So you effectively are building a feedback loop, right? Like we're talking about an OT, right? It's here's what we're checking, here's what we think, here's what we're getting back, and it allows you to take that same sort of HMI and trends that everybody's built with their different historians and their process, and put it now onto security, system lifecycle management, and day-to-day maintenance. And it's remarkably effective at taking what is supposed or what is a hunch in terms of risk and putting real context to it. So, for example, I walked into a facility and the plant manager said, "You're here to do an assessment, isn't that great? You're going to tell me that I don't change passwords and I don't patch anything. How does that help me?" It's a great question. Whereas if we have an automated data profile and inventory, and we bring in the context of saying, here's my asset, here's the missing patches, here's the known vulnerabilities, here's the compensating controls we've done on it, and here's how we've reduced the risk, now I've got a completely different perspective. And it's all dependent upon building that ecosystem. And it's a change from that first generation of security, because we're going from siloed tools that collectively give you a bunch of functions to at least pulling those tools in together and having them paint a picture of what we call a 360-degree view of the asset. So what do we recommend for the second generation approach? Well, obviously to approach it as a multidimensional or multidiscipline program. If you're looking again at what you want to do for inventory tools or for endpoint management tools or for user accounts or even just backup selection, what exactly do you have from your inventory that will help you decide how you should probably architect a backup solution? Maybe some of your inventory takes some options off the table or puts other ones in. That inventory plus that analysis of the backup will help you to design your recovery process. Not all assets are going to get a full backup daily with a weekly offsite storage. So again, as you build that multi-dimension and have the data from the different senses, you'll have a much better approach and a much more streamlined result. Always proactively work with vendors to fit into current requirements or remove barriers. Many people say, oh, yes, well, OEMs, they don't allow agents. Well, the OEMs have a lot of their own agents. Agent isn't a dirty word in OT. Working with the organization, though, is in the example I gave earlier, to say, look, there's 1,200 known risks. You can't just reduce 400 and let me live with 800. We need to find a way to get better. Aggregating data sources. You've invested lots of money. You also have a lot of people with tribal knowledge. All of that stuff can come together to give you a better view. That better view allows you to have better prioritization and triage of your risk. And it will allow you to, the fourth point or fifth point here, incorporate the management portion into planning decisions. Can't say enough about the fact that, there's lots of ways to understand how many patches are missing or how many users haven't logged in or dormant admin accounts. There's a whole other way, there's a whole other level of expertise and work required to actually manage it. And the other thing that I just wanted to sort of underscore is the Spanish Armada note there. I watched a Discovery Channel thing the other day, so suddenly I'm an expert in the Spanish Armada now. But what really struck me about the example was the Spanish Armada was much smaller in numbers and in size. But if you didn't know the story, what they did was that they built all their cannons and their ammunition at one central place, and then outfitted all their ships with the exact same stuff. Many of their opponents didn't do that. They could build whatever size and shape they wanted. And so when they came to battle, the Spanish Armada was able to crank out 2 and 3 times the volleys of cannon fire in the same time that their opponents were getting, maybe one. So it was like 3-1 or 4-1. And so the smaller numbered and smaller size ships in the Armada actually took out significantly more opponents than you might think they would, simply because they had an automated and streamlined process with consistent tools. Made a huge difference. So what are the next thing we need to do? Organizational principles. Now, there's lots of things in here, and I'm not going to go into all of them. As I mentioned, I borrowed some slides from some others. This is part of more of a larger workshop that we offer, where we talk different categories of how you build different things. And almost every one of these, you could probably spend about a 30 or 40 minute session on. I'm going to mostly drive into Think Global and Act Local. But these are all key components. If anybody wants the slides after, happy to share them. But really, a program is multidiscipline, multi-department, and requires, understanding multiple of these. And again, the data, the automated data drive from the OT environment is a key component and contributor to almost all of these in different ways and spaces. Again, I'm going to, for the sake of time, make sure I focus on the Think Global, Act Local. So what does the team look like when we get to Think Global, Act Local? What sort of things are we looking for? This is from CyberSeek's job database. And I pulled this up just for interest. I mean, a lot of the cool stuff, and don't get me wrong, I love the passive tools and threat hunters. I think that's really super cool stuff. And they're worth every penny of what that you can get. But that's really like the scouts that run on ahead and find that the giant army is waiting over the next thing. I mean, it's valuable and it's useful, but we really do need to sort of minimize our risk, right? And so if you look at the CyberSeek database, these top three categories represent, what's that, 30 to 45, so about 80%, almost 80% of the current jobs are otherwise considered management. So endpoint management, configuration management, AV updates, the care and feeding, the stuff that you can design solutions if you know your inventory, but even better, if you have automated tools, you can actually have a running start and a fighting chance at keeping up with them. And so as we get into this, I'm really advocating, that risk isn't just about being aware of it or monitoring when something happens. It's actually being proactive and reducing it as well. And so, when you get into this environment on the OT team, you're probably going to need to pull multiple people in. And I'll show what that looks like here. What we call Think Global and Act Local, we realize that a lot of those people on the previous slide don't have the ability to devote this as a full-time job. And so what we need to do is we need to be able to leverage what we do have. And so the way that we've talked about our automated approach to inventory and context coming up to that single pane of glass, you can layer that within a single environment, or you can do it across a multi-site environment as well. The concept is true in both cases. And what the premise is that at the plant level, we make sure that we have that automated inventory to cover all three assets of classes of asset, OS-based, where your traditional risk comes from, your networking gear, and even your embedded stuff. And you pull all that data up in an automated fashion. And then you add the context, you add the OT context. Is it a critical asset to your safe operations? You layer the national vulnerability database over top of that inventory. So you're doing a full analysis of risk against your inventory in an offline status. And it allows you to dive into the data without touching the systems. You add the other context of the things you invested in, like your antivirus, your whitelisting, your backup. You take all of those concepts together and you bring it into a single pane of glass at that smaller centralized team. This team can then pivot into any sort of function or analysis that you want, from lifecycle planning, how many Windows 2000, Server 2008, or Windows 7 boxes do we have to go get my extended subscription support from Microsoft? What does the vulnerability database say relative to what we have? Let's drill into my PLCs. How many Rockwell PLCs have exploitable firmware? We're going to do an upgrade in this facility or take a turnaround. Can we flash some firmware while we're doing it? And so this aggregated centralized data allows a small specialized team to be able to be very, very exacting. For me, it turns from a shotgun approach to a sniper approach. We're able to now say, look, this is my risk today or my concern, or let's just look at a dashboard and drill into it. And so what happens is that this higher level of capability is streamlined and centralized in a smaller team. This team can then do the research and the planning once with a small team with empirical data, and they can take those actions, again, using the automated environment and infrastructure we've been talking about, and they can deploy those actions in an automated fashion. Now, the really cool part is that you can stop short of actually doing anything. And so one quick example I'll give you is we had a client, the same client that the first case study was about. They were asked on a particular Saturday afternoon by the CISO if they had been done the task of removing a certain foreign-built antivirus software. And they hadn't. And so the CISO had said, well, I'm reporting to the board on Monday, so I better have a report that it's completed by Monday morning. It's Saturday afternoon. 6 coal-fired generation facilities, 4 different states. And what they were able to do was look at the single view across the 6 sites and say, filter on this particular piece of software. And they came up with 146 endpoints that had it. And then what they did next was they took the 146 endpoints and they sent a command to those 146 via the agent that was on those devices and said, uninstall this piece of software. But they set a flag. And the flag said, make this an offer. So what that meant was they then went to each of the 6 sites and they sent them a printed list of their list of assets. And remember, we put the other context in there, the asset's criticality to operations, the asset's physical location, which unit, which rack room, who the owner was. And a tech at each of the sites was able to walk down to each and every one of those assets and see in the system tray the offer to remove the software. And so the OT tech at each of the sites then accepted the offer, watched it remove, rebooted if it needed it, saw that it came back up, checked in like it was supposed to, moved on to the next one. So we had this think global, this one small team identify and automate as much of the process as possible across almost 150 assets. But you had OT oversight that last mile. And so this particular organization was able to identify and remove and send that report to the CISO like you'd asked within 90 minutes. Not days, weeks, or months like would typically happen in an OT environment. 90 minutes later, they had it and they verified it. That's what this automated infrastructure and that insight allows them to do. And that's what Think Global, Act Local is. But I want to show you a bigger example because it compounds. It's not every day that the CISO phones and says, uninstall your software. Let's take a more real day-to-day scenario. Client company, profile, large operating company, thousands of miles assets, large transmission distribution company. Distributed team of SCADA all throughout North America relative to the various sites along the lines. Larger ones obviously were manned, smaller ones had people at least within so many minutes or kilometers of a drive. Over time, due to mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, et cetera, thousands of assets comprised of varying OSs and vintages. And all the assets were spread out across hundreds of physical sites. So what happened was, the automation didn't work. I'm supposed to share the cool part for you on the right, but go ahead and read ahead. Without the Global Act Local program, and this is actually the same client, a couple different times, once before they had deployed this automated and once after. So it was a very good before and after sort of analysis. When they first had a result, a security result come out, i.e. Bluekeep as an update, a security update that was required, without this sort of insight and this automated infrastructure, they pulled dozens of people and spreadsheets into a single meeting. They ended up having multiple meetings over the next few days just to sort of understand which order they were going to go into. The meetings stayed up, but they weren't as frenzied or as well attended over the next few days as they got to the execution phase. But they didn't really start with a concrete understanding of scope. They were kind of discovering as they went. They also absolutely had to make many guesses and assumptions like system criticality, owner, location. I distinctly remember at one point in time, they were looking at a list of IPs and they weren't sure who owned it. So they actually remote desktopped to those IPs and went into the start menu to see what programs were running on it. If they saw Maximo, for example, they'd go talk to the Maximo people and ask if they knew of this particular name. Like it was really, unfortunately typical, but very difficult for them to figure out what they had and where they were going. They started manually patching, and they also started manually tracking in those same spreadsheets and combination thereof. The total effort, and this was rough because, at the beginning, a lot of operational staff were pulled off of their day jobs. And then, as they started to move down the road, some of them sort of peeled off. But in general, they estimated that they used 6 full-time equivalents for about 10 weeks. And that overall, they'd spent collectively with the management overseeing the reporting and tracking and providing air cover about 2,500 hours to reach about 90% coverage. And it was either patched or not, and that was it. Once they'd gone through this, they went and deployed the technology. A few months later, something similar came along where they had a need to understand and identify and patch and roll out multiple places. They then had a very different starting point. They went into the dashboard, they found their 360-degree view of assets. They were able to see instantly which assets needed the patch and which didn't. They could also sort that view of assets by location, by asset type, by criticality, by owner, by vintage, by OS, by whatever. So their kickoff meeting was a little bit different. They had a small set of key personnel, that same sort of think global team. And their first task was they used the agent to disable remote desktop on all the endpoints. This is first thing Monday morning when they decided to do something. Send an email out to the entire field staff saying, if you need something, enter a ticket, we'll open it for 3 hours, we'll turn it back off when you're gone. And so they had the ability to put real granular, immediate control in place while they bought the time to deploy their patch program. They then, while they were sitting there in the meeting, starting the planning, they'd also queued all of the files locally on the endpoint. So in this SCADA distributed environment with low bandwidth issues, they had the architecture set up to slowly trickle files across low bandwidth. So give the files a head start so that when you come out to actually do something, they're already there for you. Again, automating as much of this as possible. They then did a combination of stuff that was in a data center or a manned facility, or newer vintage of assets, or less critical systems or redundant systems. So really sort of test and see what the environments were. And they were able to triage which ones they wanted to patch first versus last, either by criticality to operations and needing to protect it, or fragility of the system and being able to feel more comfortable with what they were doing on what type of asset. But it went from a patchwork of, I think I can do this, I think I can do that, to no, here's empirical evidence as to the system criticality, whether it's at a manned location, whether we have had previous issues with it or what have you. So non-patch systems, though, they were also able to leave the remote desktop turned off if need be. They could disable the guest account from initiating remote desktop. So they, in all cases, were able to not only deploy the patch, but increase the security profile. And the ones they couldn't get to, they at least were able to minimize the risk. All the progress as they went was reported in the live dashboard. So as you patched the system, it came out of the big long laundry list of assets that were in scope. And so as that list reduced and your overall red, green, yellow gauges got more green, you could see the actual progress day in and day out. Overall, the total effort, they only needed 3 core staff. And then field techs here and there, they were put on notice, hey, you may be asked to drive out to the site tomorrow and reboot the system and make sure the patch took, and off you go. But those techs were able to roll that in because they had a heads up, they knew what was happening, it was all scheduled. Overall, they took probably just a little less than 75% savings in the hours spent. So you can see there, they spent around 600 hours to reach the same 90%, but the other 10% were also locked down. So you can see how, you know, this central team building the solution or a path forward once, being able to take that path and have it match criticality, system fragility, ownership, you know, it's a huge difference. If I show you today all your risk in an environment, I'll show you 30,000 risks. Understanding that you probably want to take the critical risk on high impact assets that maybe failed their last backup is your 50 of the 50,000 that you absolutely need to focus on. That's what this starts to build. And so we're really advocating that as you continue to evolve, you know what done looks like and look towards automation. It's the only way we're going to fight it. So what are the benefits? Well, the cost is greatly reduced. I mean, you just look at the 2,500 hours versus 600. The lost opportunity on the other projects that those operational staff were not doing for 10 weeks. Central View leverages scarce resources. You can only have so many people that understand, that get it in OT security. And there needs to be on that central team, both IT and OT. Because IT can tell what the risk is and what sort of things can be done to maybe reduce it, and the OT can tell you whether or not you're allowed to do that on that endpoint. And so that the other thing about a specialized team with global reach is it reduces duplication. One of our clients today is looking at 6,000 assets in 57 countries around the world, and so they're able to take that and really supersize this scaled approach towards, you know, smaller team having a much wider impact in an automated way from that central visibility. The other thing that's key is that OT safety is ensured. As I mentioned, you can have really granular control over what you actually do. I can stop the central team at the analysis, the research, and even the preparation, but the final mile is always handled by OT should you require it. And having that same group at the top means you can have an IT-OT lockstep decision-making process in support of exactly what you are or are not doing. Providing context, this is key. Not all assets are created equal in OT. You just ask any operator which system that when you see the alarm for it, you know that you're phoning home and saying you're not going to be home for dinner, versus which one can you live without for a few days or weeks until Monday morning. And they all know that. it's there, but it also aids in the decision-making process. And then tracking. I always used to joke that in security, as a consultant, if you do everything I tell you, nothing will happen, right? It's not really the reality, but ROI and understanding your true risk, whether that's purely from a risk perspective or whether that's from a budget and a staffing justification or prioritization perspective, is key. One of the things that I haven't talked about, but this type of approach effectively negates the need to do an annual paper-based exercise of having someone external come in and do an assessment and hand you the list and hope you improve between now and the next time they come. You still could have somebody come in and look at your stuff to make sure that you're paying attention and doing the right things, but it's near real time. So the client I gave the example of with the antivirus software, they're updating their data every 15 minutes. Their inventory and the risk associated with it is never more than 15 minutes old. That's a completely different game than what we're typically playing in OT today. There's a little bit of the dashboard. We're nearing the end here. I want to leave some time for some questions. But you can measure, this is across the CSC, how they're doing relative to the different controls in CSC 20. And options, this was just talking about, we can't boil the ocean. We've seen clients do everything from, let's first look at our OS-based devices, or let's first pick, so the one client that is in 57 countries, they're just doing Windows everywhere. That's what they want to do first. They're going to come back later and do networking. The contrast, we have a global pharmaceutical client that is doing, as far as they're concerned, from a financial perspective, the top 5 facilities that are the most important for their financial bottom line, and then the next 5 and the next 5 until they roll through it. You can manage this in any way, shape, or form. We're not trying to boil the ocean and say, throw everything out and start from scratch and build an entire program. It's understand what that endpoint looks like and grow into these in whatever fits your organization. Benefits of this, twofold, just quickly. On the project side, you end up with multi-division, multi-department involvement. It is a way to draw people together. There's so much discussion about IT-OT convergence. The reality is it's a team. In IT, it's a team. You cannot have deeply siloed security practice in OT because there's such a wide potential impact across so many operational aspects. So you get better support and upkeep during the project into maintenance mode. Quite often a project team comes in, deploys the technology, high-five themselves and leave, and the people left around are going, well, what's this for and who's going to manage it, right? So you get much better buy-in, and you can anticipate and manage cost. If I can tell you in real time exactly how many assets you have and how many need a backup or how many need this patch, you can very clearly, either with your outsourced organization or with the project-based support or summer interns, you have exactly 327 patches to apply, or you have exactly 83 Rockwell PLCs with exploitable firmware. You have definitive scope to manage. On the maintenance side, you get much better increase in accuracy, visibility, security, compliance across the board. And so in summary, risk is on the rise. It's not going to go away. We continue to increase our technical debt, and there's growth in the technology and the exploits. An absolutely programmatic plan is required. Siloed tools and individuals or disciplines just aren't going to cut it. And all roads, as far as we're concerned, lead us. You have to have some sort of comprehensive real-time inventory. I mean, the reality in OT in any environment is that security is a fast-moving thing, and so the better we can tap into what the current status is as changes either improve as we lock them down or devolve as new risks come out is key. Most of the cookie is how we got here. That plus a few legacy challenges like disparate tools and silos of responsibility. So really the second generation of OT security would realistically and significantly be improved if we just adjusted sort of the way we looked at this slightly. That think global, act local hopefully is of value to some people. Be happy to talk more with anybody who wants. I think we got about 5 minutes left. I know I am between you and the weekend, but that is what I brought today. I thank you all for spending some time. There is a chat here. I've got let me see, on the chat side, I've had some comments as we went, which was interesting. Thank you for the feedback. But in the session here, if you had any questions, please throw them in here. Otherwise, I thank you everyone for coming, and there's my contact information if anybody wants to pick this up after the fact during the next week. I'd be more than happy to share some more case studies and war stories if anyone's interested. Thank you so much for the time, and thank you B-Sides for the platform and everybody spending a little bit of your afternoon with me.